In 2016, a woman vanished on Mount Washington's unforgiving slopes. 3 months later, her husband, driven by a hope he couldn't extinguish, found her backpack entombed in snow. Her name was Anna. His was Ben. They had been married for 12 years, a quiet life built on shared adventures and a deep, unspoken understanding. Anna loved the mountains, particularly the stark, challenging beauty of the Presidential Range. She was experienced, meticulous in her preparations. She always said the mountains demand respect. Ben never worried. Not really. Not until she didn't come back. That October day had been crisp, clear, perfect for a long hike. Anna planned to tackle a familiar loop, one she'd done half a dozen times. She kissed Ben goodbye, her eyes bright with anticipation. Her last words to him were light, casual. She said, "I'll be back before dark. Don't let the dog eat my boots." He smiled, watched her drive away, the familiar red of her car shrinking in the distance. A perfectly ordinary morning. How could he have known it was the edge of everything? Evening came, then true dark. No, Anna. Her phone went straight to voicemail. A knot of coldness began to tighten in Ben's chest. He called her friends. No one had heard from her. He called the local ranger station. Their voices were calm, professional, but an undercurrent of concern was there. Missing hiker protocols. They asked about her route, her gear, her experience. He answered, his own voice sounding distant. By the next morning, a full-scale search was underway. Rangers, volunteers, dogs. Helicopters thrummed overhead when the weather allowed, their sound a hollow beat against the vast silence of the peaks. Ben walked the lower trails with them, calling her name until his throat was raw. He pointed out her car, still parked at the trailhead, a silent, reproachful monument. Days blurred into a nightmare of waiting, of forced coffee and clipped updates. They found a footprint here, a possible scuff mark there. Nothing concrete. The mountain was vast, indifferent. It held its secrets tight. The weather, always a beast on Washington, turned vicious. Early snows came, heavy and wet. Then the brutal cold of deep autumn locking everything in ice. The official search was scaled back, then, reluctantly, officially suspended. Too dangerous for the crews. Resources needed elsewhere. They offered condolences, gentle words about the mountain's power, the slim chances. Ben listened, nodded, but something inside him refused to break. Or perhaps it had already broken, and this was just the shell of him, moving on instinct. He remembered Anna telling him once, after a difficult climb, that the mountain doesn't care if you live or die, but it shows you who you are. Who was he now, without her? The house felt enormous, empty. Her side of the bed was cold. Her hiking boots stood by the door, untouched. He'd stare at them, sometimes for an hour, as if expecting her to walk in, scold him for worrying, and pull them on. The dog, sensing the shift, the gaping hole in their small family, whined softly, pressing against Ben's legs. Winter settled in, thick and unforgiving. The news crews left. The sympathetic calls dwindled. Life, for the rest of the world, went on, but Ben's life had stopped that October day. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. He replayed their last morning, searching for a sign, a premonition he'd missed. There was nothing. Just ordinary love, ordinary plans. How could something so ordinary lead to this abyss? He felt a hollowness that ached, a constant, dull throb of absence. He knew they said it was hopeless, the officials, the experienced searchers. They said winter on Mount Washington was a death sentence for anyone lost. But what if they were wrong? What if they had missed something small, something crucial, buried now under the snow? A desperate, irrational thought began to take root in the frozen ground of his grief. He had to go back. He had to look for himself. Ben spent the next few weeks in a haze of grim preparation. He spread Anna's hiking maps across the kitchen table, the creases worn, her faint pencil marks noting viewpoints, tricky sections, sources of water. He traced her intended route again and again, his finger hovering over the rugged contours. Where could she have gone? Where could a person simply vanish? He bought new winter gear, the best he could afford: insulated boots, thermal layers, crampons, an ice axe. He studied weather patterns, avalanche warnings, articles about winter survival. Some part of him knew it was madness. He wasn't a seasoned winter mountaineer like Anna, but the alternative, doing nothing, accepting the silence, was a slow death of its own. He had to try. What else was there? His friends, when he finally told them his plan, were aghast. His sister cried, begged him not to go. He heard their words, understood their fear, but it was like listening through thick glass. Their logic couldn't penetrate the singular, driving purpose that had consumed him. He said, "I have to." There was no more explanation he could offer. He felt a strange calm, the kind that comes when all other options have been exhausted. His first solo trip back to the mountain was in early January. The air was bitingly cold, the sky a hard, brilliant blue. The lower trails were packed ice, the trees skeletal and stark, laden with snow. He parked in the same empty lot where Anna's car had been. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground and the whisper of the wind through the high pines. He felt her presence everywhere, and nowhere at all. It was a torment. He started up the trail she was known to have taken, the one most heavily searched. He moved slowly, methodically, his eyes scanning every shadow, every snowdrift, every exposed rock face. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: a piece of clothing, a sign of her passing, anything. He found nothing but the pristine, unforgiving wilderness. The sheer scale of the mountain, its raw power, pressed down on him. How could one small woman stand a chance against this? He pushed himself, driven by a desperate energy. He checked under fallen logs, peered into crevices. His breath plumed in the frigid air. He noticed things he hadn't before, things the search teams, with their broader sweeps, might have missed. A series of oddly spaced indentations in a snowbank, too regular for an animal. Were they from a trekking pole, used for balance before a fall? Or just the wind's artistry? He dug with his gloved hands, his heart pounding. Just ice. His hope, a fragile thing, flickered. He remembered Anna's laughter, the way she described the feeling of reaching a summit, tired but exhilarated. She'd said it was like touching something ancient, something true. Now, the mountain felt like a malevolent entity, jealously guarding its prize. Or was that just his grief, twisting his perception? The sun began to dip, painting the snowfields in hues of orange and purple. Beautiful, but also a warning. He had to turn back before darkness fell completely. As he descended, a fresh wave of despair washed over him. He felt a cold dread, deeper than the wind's chill. Was he just chasing ghosts up here? Was the mountain truly empty? Or was it holding a secret too terrible to reveal? Ben fell into a grim routine. Every weekend, weather permitting, he drove to Mount Washington. He'd pick a section of Anna's known route, or an area adjacent to it, and search, methodically, painstakingly. He learned to read the snow, the subtle shifts in terrain. He learned the bite of the wind, the treacherous nature of ice, hidden beneath a thin layer of powder. The mountain was teaching him, shaping him, just as it had shaped Anna. But what was it trying to show him? The early winter snows had been followed by more, burying the landscape deeper and deeper. Each fresh fall felt like another layer of separation. another shovel of earth on a grave. Yet, he persisted. He told himself he was looking for clues, for answers. But perhaps he was just looking for her, for some lingering trace of her spirit in the place she had loved most. He'd often speak to her in his mind, asking her where she'd gone, what had happened. The silence was his only reply. Sometimes, he'd find small, insignificant things. A discarded granola bar wrapper, not her brand. A broken branch that seemed out of place. Once, a single brightly colored feather, probably from a blue jay, snagged on a thorny bush. Each discovery sent a brief, painful jolt of adrenaline through him, quickly followed by the dull ache of disappointment. None of it was hers. None of it led anywhere. He rarely saw other hikers. The main trails were sometimes used by experienced ice climbers or winter mountaineers, but Ben often found himself utterly alone in the vast, frozen wilderness. The solitude was both a comfort and a curse. It allowed him to focus, to immerse himself in the search, but it also amplified his grief, his sense of isolation. He felt like the last man on earth, searching for the only other person who mattered. Flashbacks would ambush him. Anna, laughing as they assembled a new tent in the backyard. Anna, poring over maps by the fireplace, planning their next adventure. Anna, her face lit with awe as they watched a sunrise from a remote peak years ago. These memories were precious, painful. They fueled his search, but also underscored the enormity of his loss. What would he do if he never found her? How could he live with the not knowing? The physical toll was immense. His body ached. His face was raw from the wind. But the psychological strain was worse. Hope is a cruel companion. It would flare with every potential sign, then die, leaving him emptier than before. Some days, he felt a profound connection to the mountain, a sense of its ancient, implacable presence. Other days, he hated it, saw it as a monstrous, indifferent killer. He was walking a knife edge of sanity, and he knew it. One particularly bleak Saturday in late January, almost 3 months since Anna disappeared, he was searching a less-traveled feeder trail, one that branched off her main route. The official search had likely given it only a cursory look, deeming it an unlikely path for her to have taken. The snow here was deeper, less disturbed. He pushed through a thicket of snow-laden firs, the branches whipping at his face. He almost missed it. Tucked near the base of a large boulder, almost hidden by a drift, was a small, brightly colored energy bar wrapper. He picked it up with a shaking hand. It wasn't Anna's preferred brand. His heart sank. Just another piece of litter. But then he looked closer. This brand was relatively new, not widely available. And this particular flavor, he remembered Anna buying a box just before her last hike, curious to try them. Could it be? It was so small, so insignificant. But it was something. A flicker. He scanned the area with renewed intensity. Who else might have been here, eating this specific bar? Was it a coincidence, or the first real thread? That small, discarded wrapper changed something in Ben. It was tenuous, yes, easily dismissed as coincidence, but it was hers. He was almost certain. He knelt in the snow, turning the crinkled plastic over and over in his gloved fingers. Why here? This trail was a detour, leading towards a rougher, more exposed ridgeline. It wasn't on her planned route. Had she decided on a whim to explore, or had something drawn her this way? The next day, Sunday, he returned to that exact spot. The weather had worsened overnight. A biting wind swept down from the higher peaks, carrying stinging pellets of ice. Visibility was poor. Part of him, the rational part, screamed to turn back, to wait for a better day. But the wrapper had ignited a desperate urgency. He felt closer to her than he had in months. He pushed onward, following the faint indentation of the side trail. It was barely visible under the fresh snow, more a subtle depression than a clear path. The trees thinned, giving way to exposed rock and stunted, wind-scoured shrubs. The terrain grew steeper, more treacherous. He had to use his ice axe for balance, kicking his crampons hard into the frozen crust. He thought about Anna, her skill, her confidence. Would she have come this way alone? It seemed uncharacteristically risky, especially if the weather was turning. He scanned the ground, the rocks, the snowdrifts, his eyes aching from the strain. He was looking for another sign, any sign, a scuff mark on a rock, a broken twig, anything. Hours passed. The wind howled, a mournful, desolate sound. His hope, so recently rekindled, began to fade again, beaten down by the sheer brutal indifference of the mountain. He was about to give up, to admit defeat for the day, when he slipped. His right foot shot out from under him on a patch of slick ice, hidden beneath a thin layer of powder snow. He fell heavily, his shoulder slamming against a snow-covered boulder. Pain shot through him, sharp and sickening. He lay there for a moment, gasping, the wind stealing his breath. Stupid, he thought. Getting injured out here alone was a death sentence. He pushed himself up, his arm throbbing, and then he saw it. Where his fall had dislodged, a small cascade of snow from the side of the boulder, a tiny patch of bright, unnatural color was visible. Red. A deep, familiar crimson. His heart leaped into his throat. He scrambled towards it, his injured shoulder forgotten. He began to dig frantically with his gloved hands, then with his ice axe, chipping away at the compacted snow and ice. The patch of red grew larger. It was fabric, strong nylon fabric. His breath came in ragged gasps. It couldn't be. After all this time, after so much nothing. He clawed away more snow, revealing a strap, then a buckle. And then, unmistakably, the curved top of a backpack. Anna's backpack. The one she'd had for years, her faithful companion on countless trails. It was caked in ice, partially frozen to the rock, but it was hers. There was no doubt. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees crashed over him. Relief, sharp and agonizing. Grief, a fresh, raw tearing, and a horrifying, sickening dread. Finding the backpack meant, what? It meant she had been here. It meant something had happened here. He fumbled with the main zipper, his fingers clumsy with cold and emotion. The teeth were frozen solid. He used the pick of his ice axe to carefully chip away the ice, his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, with a wrench, the zipper groaned open a few inches. He peered inside, his breath catching in his throat, a silent scream trapped within him. What secrets did it hold? What would it tell him about Anna's last moments on this desolate, frozen mountain? Ben's fingers, numb with cold and trembling uncontrollably, worked at the stiff, frozen zipper of Anna's backpack. Each metallic rasp seemed to echo the frantic beating of his own heart. The opening widened, revealing the shadowed interior. He reached in, his breath a cloud in the frigid air, and pulled out the first item his hand touched. Her aluminum water bottle. He unscrewed the cap. It was half empty, a mundane detail, yet it struck him with a fresh pang of sorrow. She had been alive, drinking water, right here. Next, he found her emergency whistle, still attached to its lanyard. A small, bright orange thing, meant to signal for help. Had she used it? Or had events overtaken her too quickly? He blew into it, a short, sharp, desperate sound that was immediately swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the mountain. The sound felt like a profanation, a futile cry against an immutable fate. Beneath the whistle lay her compass and a folded map of the area. He carefully unfolded the map, his eyes scanning its familiar lines, and then he saw it. A small, hastily drawn X in pencil, marking a spot far off any established trail, deep in a rugged, almost inaccessible ravine to the north. It wasn't part of her planned route, not even close. Why would she mark that? What was there? A chill, entirely separate from the biting wind, snaked down his spine. There were a few energy bars, the new brand he'd noticed the wrapper from. 2 were missing from the pack of 5. She had eaten, she had been functioning, and then, her phone. He pulled it out, his hope surging irrationally, then crashing. The screen was dark, lifeless. The cold would have killed the battery in hours. He tucked it carefully into his own pocket, a fragile link to her last conscious moments. Finally, at the very bottom of the main compartment, almost hidden beneath a spare pair of wool socks, was her trail journal, a small, spiral-bound notebook, its cover damp and slightly warped. Anna always carried it. She sketched in it, noted observations about flora and fauna, jotted down thoughts. His hands shook so violently he could barely open it. The pages were stiff with cold, some stuck together with ice crystals. He gently separated them, his heart pounding. Many of the early pages were filled with her neat handwriting, observations from previous hikes. He flipped towards the end, searching for the last entries. The ink was slightly blurred in places, as if touched by snowflakes before it dried. The first entry for that hike started normally. Descriptions of the crisp air, the autumn colors, the familiar joy of the ascent. Perfect day, she'd written. Mountain feels welcoming. Then, the tone began to shift. An entry dated later that day, the handwriting a little less steady. She mentioned seeing another hiker, distant, indistinct, on a parallel ridge. Unusual for that time of year, on a less popular route. She'd felt a prickle of unease, but dismissed it. Probably just another soul enjoying the quiet, she wrote. But the next line read, "Felt like I was being watched for a moment. Strange." He turned the page. The final entry. The handwriting was rushed, jagged. It was short, almost frantic. Took a detour. Map unclear here. Thought I saw a quicker way down. Weather turning faster than forecast. Then, a chilling sentence. Heard a sound, not an animal. Twice now. And the very last words, scrawled, barely legible, as if she'd been interrupted mid-thought. He's closer, moving fast. Trying to... The sentence ended there, a ragged tail of ink. Ben stared at the words, his blood running cold. He's closer. Who was he? Not an animal. This wasn't just an accident, a slip on the ice, a victim of the elements. This was something else. Something terrifying. The mid-story spike of a different kind of horror. Anna hadn't just gotten lost. She had been scared. She had been pursued. The wind howled around him, no longer just a natural force, but a chorus of her fear. What had happened after that last desperate entry? What monster had she encountered in this vast frozen wilderness? Ben carefully repacked Anna's belongings into the backpack, his mind reeling. The journal's last words echoed, a horrifying loop. He's closer, moving fast. This changed everything. The grief was still a raw wound, but now it was laced with a chilling, sickening fear and a burning anger. Anna hadn't just succumbed to the mountain. Someone, or something, had terrified her, hunted her. He secured the backpack, a precious, terrible burden, and began the treacherous descent. His injured shoulder throbbed, but he barely noticed. Every shadow seemed to lengthen. Every snap of a frozen twig under his boots sounded like a footstep behind him. The mountain, once a place of shared joy with Anna, now felt alien, hostile, a witness to an unknown horror. Was the he from her journal still out here? The local police station was small, quiet. The officer on duty, a young man named Miller, listened patiently as Ben, his voice hoarse with emotion and exhaustion, recounted his discovery. He laid the backpack on the counter, then the journal, opened to that last, terrifying page. Miller read it, his expression shifting from polite concern to something sharper, more focused. He said, "We'll need to take this, Mr. Henderson." "Of course." Another detective, older, with weary eyes, was called in, Detective Rourke. He examined the journal, the map with its cryptic X, the contents of the backpack. He asked Ben to go over Anna's experience, her planned route, anything unusual leading up to her hike. Ben told him everything, his voice flat, exhausted. Rourke listened, nodding slowly, his gaze thoughtful. He seemed to take it seriously, which was a small, cold comfort. He said, "We treated this as a tragic accident, Mr. Henderson. This changes the potential narrative." They tried to charge Anna's phone. Ben waited, pacing the small, sterile room they'd put him in. Hours seemed to pass. Finally, Rourke returned. He said, "We got it powered on." Battery was completely drained. Took a while. Mostly scenic shots from the hike. The early part of the trail. Nothing obviously out of the ordinary. Ben's hope, a fragile thing, dipped again. Then Rourke added, "But there's one at the very end. It's blurry. Very blurry. Like she took it in a hurry, without aiming." Rourke showed him the image on the phone's small screen. It was a chaotic mess of greens and browns, clearly taken in motion, pointing downwards and to the side. At first, Ben saw nothing. Just a blur of foliage and rock. But Rourke zoomed in on one section. There, amidst the jumble, was a patch of darker color. Something on the trunk of a tree. It was indistinct, but it looked intentional. A mark, almost like a symbol. He asked, "What is that?" Rourke frowned, rubbing his chin. He said, "I don't know. Could be anything. A shadow, a natural scar on the bark. But it's odd." He paused. Then he looked at Ben, a strange light in his weary eyes. He said, "That mark on the tree, I think I've seen something like it before, a long time ago." A new kind of dread, cold and sharp, pierced through Ben's exhaustion. Something like it before? What did that mean? The detective's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. This wasn't just about Anna anymore, was it? This was potentially older, bigger. The X on the map suddenly felt even more sinister. What terrible secret was hidden in that remote ravine? And what was the meaning of that strange, blurry mark on a tree in Anna's last, desperate photo? Detective Rourke leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, thoughtful. He said, "Years ago, maybe 15, 20, there were a couple of odd cases, unexplained disappearances, further north, different range, but still deep wilderness, never solved. One of them, a lone hunter, they found his camp, but no sign of him. There was a similar kind of carving on a tree nearby. Crude, almost ritualistic, some said. But there was no other evidence. It was dismissed. Animal scratchings, vandals, too little to go on." He looked at Ben. He added, "Until now, I'd almost forgotten. But that mark in your wife's photo, it's close. Too close for comfort." Ben felt a growing unease. This wasn't just a random act of violence, then? This could be a pattern? A predator who had operated in these mountains before? The thought was sickening. He asked, "What about the X on Anna's map?" Rourke nodded. He said, "That's our next point of interest. It's a bad area. Steep, unstable. Search and rescue know it. They call it the Devil's Notch. Not a place people go by choice. Why would Anna mark it? Why would she go there? The authorities were now fully engaged. Anna's case had transformed from a tragic missing person to a potential homicide, or at least a highly suspicious death. But the Devil's Notch was treacherous, and with the current snowpack, an official search would be incredibly dangerous. Slow. Resources were still an issue. Rourke was honest. He said, "It could take days, even weeks, to mount a proper, safe search of that area, Ben." Days? Weeks? Ben couldn't wait. The thought of Anna, alone, scared, in that terrible place, and the he from her journal, he couldn't sit by. He told Rourke, "I have to go. I know that area from maps. I can get there." Rourke tried to dissuade him. "Too dangerous. You're not trained for that kind of solo recovery in winter." But he saw the look in Ben's eyes, the same desperate resolve that had driven him to find the backpack. Reluctantly, Rourke agreed to a compromise. He couldn't officially sanction it, but he assigned a young, fit local deputy, a man named Peters who knew the backcountry, to accompany Ben. Not as an official search, more as an escort, for Ben's safety. Peters was quiet, serious. He'd grown up in these mountains. He understood their beauty and their brutality. The journey to the Devil's Notch was grueling. It took them the better part of a day, even with Peters' knowledge of the terrain. They left the marked trails far behind, pushing through deep snow, scrambling over ice-slicked boulders. The ravine was a scar on the mountainside, a place the sun rarely touched. The air was heavy, cold, unnaturally still. Ben felt a palpable sense of menace, of wrongness. They found the spot Anna had marked with an X. It was a small, slightly sheltered alcove beneath an overhang of rock, and there, etched into the trunk of a gnarled ancient pine, was a mark. The same crude, unsettling symbol from Anna's blurry photograph, the one Rourke remembered. It was clearer here, deeper. Some parts looked old, weathered, but other parts of the carving seemed fresher, as if it had been maintained, touched up. Ben's blood ran cold. This was it. This was where Anna had been. But why? What was here? He scanned the ground. Disturbed snow, a few broken twigs that seemed out of place. Had she rested here? Hidden here? Then Peters, who had been circling the small area, called out softly, "Ben, look at this." Hidden beneath a small pile of rocks, almost invisible, was a tattered piece of fabric. Bright blue. He recognized it instantly. It was the same color, the same material, as Anna's favorite lightweight windbreaker. A piece of it, ripped, as if torn off in a struggle, or snagged violently. His heart seized. She was here, definitely here, and something terrible had happened in this cold, desolate place. As he stood there, a sudden gust of wind moaned through the ravine, sounding almost like a whisper. Or was it something else? A snapping twig further up the slope? He spun around, his senses screaming. Was someone watching them? The discovery of the torn blue fabric, so undeniably Anna's, solidified the horror. She hadn't just passed through this desolate spot. She had been here, and it had been violent enough to rip her jacket. Ben felt a fresh wave of cold dread. Was this where she fell, or where she was attacked? Deputy Peters, his face grim, contacted Rourke via his radio, his voice low, describing the scene, the mark on the tree, the fabric. The official search, Rourke promised, would now focus entirely on Devil's Notch and the surrounding area, starting immediately. But Ben couldn't just stand by. He felt a desperate need to keep looking, to understand. While Peter secured the immediate area around the marked tree, Ben began to cast wider circles, his eyes scanning for any other sign. The terrain was nightmarish, steep, broken, a jumble of rocks and fallen trees, all blanketed in deep, unstable snow. He moved carefully, his ice axe a constant companion. About 50 yards from the marked tree, further into the shadowed heart of the ravine, he found it. Tucked into a narrow cleft between two large boulders, almost invisible, was a crude, makeshift shelter. Old, weathered tarpaulins stretched over fallen branches, weighed down with rocks. It was small, barely large enough for one person to crawl into, and it stank, a foul, animalistic odor, mixed with the damp scent of decay. His heart hammered. Was this where he lived? The person from Anna's journal? He called out to Peters, his voice tight. The deputy joined him, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm on his belt. Together, they cautiously approached. Peters used his flashlight to peer inside the low opening. It was dark, squalid, a pile of filthy rags that might have been a bed, some rusted cans, and something else. Peters reached in carefully and pulled out a crudely fashioned wooden bowl, and then a small, disturbingly sharp knife, its blade stained. Ben felt sick. This was a lair. This was where something inhuman, or someone who had lost their humanity, had holed up, and Anna had stumbled upon it, or been dragged here. Detective Rourke and a small, specialized search team arrived by late afternoon, airlifted as close as the helicopter dared, then hiking the rest of the way. They were grim-faced, professional. They began a meticulous search of the makeshift shelter and the surrounding area. Ben watched, numb, as they pulled out more items. A tattered blanket. Some discarded food wrappers, different from Anna's. Then one of the searchers let out a low exclamation. He held up a small, hand-drawn map. It was sketched on a piece of what looked like dried animal skin. The lines were crude, but the landmarks were recognizable. Peaks, valleys, streams of the local area. And on this map, several locations were circled in what looked like charcoal. One circle was around the Devil's Notch. Another was clearly marking the area where Ben had found Anna's backpack. And a third, much further out, deeper into the most remote, untamed wilderness, was also circled. Chillingly, Rourke recognized that third circled area. It corresponded to the location where that lone hunter had vanished, all those years ago, the one with the similar tree carving. The connection was undeniable, terrifying. This wasn't just about Anna. This was a hunting ground. How many others had been circled on this grim, silent map? The discovery of the crude map sent a fresh shockwave through the already tense atmosphere. This wasn't random. This was systematic. The circled locations, the recurring symbol on the trees, it painted a horrifying picture of a predator who knew these mountains intimately, who had perhaps been using them as a hunting ground for years, even decades. The Devil's Notch shelter wasn't just a hideout, it was a base of operations. The search team, now galvanized by this new evidence, intensified their efforts. They fanned out from the shelter, meticulously examining every inch of the treacherous terrain. Ben stayed close to Rourke, a silent, haunted observer. He felt a strange detachment, as if watching a nightmare unfold from outside his own body. The question swirled, who was this person? Were they still out here? And the most agonizing question of all, where was Anna? As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow, one of the searchers, working a particularly dense thicket of firs about 100 yards upstream from the shelter, let out a sharp call. Rourke and Ben rushed over. The searcher pointed. There, partially concealed beneath a recent fall of snow and a tangle of dead branches, was a shape, a human shape. Ben's world tilted. His breath hitched. He knew. Before they even cleared the snow, he just knew. Rourke put a steadying hand on his arm, his voice gentle but firm. He said, "Ben, maybe you should wait." But Ben shook his head, pulling away. He had to see. He had to know. They carefully brushed away the snow. First, a boot emerged, caked in frozen mud. Then a leg, clad in familiar hiking pants. And then, her face. Anna. Pale, still, her eyes closed as if in sleep. There was a dark bruise on her temple, a scattering of scratches on her cheek. But she looked peaceful, untouched by the horror they had been uncovering. Ben sank to his knees in the snow, a choked sob escaping him. It was over. The searching, the not knowing. It was all over. He reached out a trembling hand, wanting to touch her, to smooth her hair, but a gloved hand, one of the forensic team, gently intercepted him. Not yet. The preliminary assessment at the scene was grimly efficient. It appeared Anna had suffered a fall, perhaps disoriented and fleeing, hitting her head. She might have been unconscious or dazed. The cold would have done the rest. There were no immediate, obvious signs of a violent struggle on her person, but it was too soon to rule anything out. The full examination would tell more. Had she been running from the occupant of that shelter when she fell? Had he found her there, injured, and simply left her to the elements? Or was there something more direct, more malevolent? The team worked through the fading light to carefully extricate Anna's body, to document everything. Ben watched, a hollow ache in his chest. This was the horrifying discovery his search had led to. Not just the backpack, but this final, terrible confirmation. As they were preparing to move Anna, Rourke, who had been re-examining the meager contents of the squalid shelter with a powerful flashlight, called Ben over. His voice was subdued. He said, "Look at this." Tucked deep into a crevice in the rock wall at the back of the shelter, almost invisible, was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was weathered, smooth, clearly old. Ben stared at it, his blood turning to ice. It was identical to a little wooden bird charm Anna had kept on her keychain for years, a cheap souvenir she'd bought on one of their early trips together. She'd lost it, she thought, on a hike in a completely different national park, almost a decade ago. She'd been so upset about it at the time. How in God's name had it ended up here, in this monster's den, on this mountain, so many years later? The implications were staggering, unthinkable. Had this person been collecting things? For how long? From how far away? The small bird, a symbol of lost innocence, now felt like the most terrifying object Ben had ever seen. It hinted at a history, a depth of obsession that was almost beyond comprehension. The small wooden bird was a chilling coda to an already horrific scene. It suggested a longevity, a wider range to this unknown individual's activities that was deeply unsettling. Had he found it? Or had Anna, in some desperate, delirious moment, recognized something of his pattern, something that connected to her own distant past, her own lost trinket? The question would likely never be answered. The occupant of the shelter was gone, vanished like a ghost into the wilderness, leaving behind only his grim leavings and a legacy of fear. No trace of him was ever found, despite extensive searches. He remained a phantom, a dark whisper in the mountain's lore. Anna was brought down from the mountain. The official cause of death was listed as hypothermia, secondary to a head injury consistent with a fall. The investigators believed she had likely become disoriented, perhaps pursued or frightened by the shelter's occupant, fled into the treacherous terrain of Devil's Notch, fell, and succumbed to the elements. Whether the mysterious individual had directly caused her fall, or simply found her afterwards and did nothing, or worse, remained an agonizing uncertainty for Ben. The public story was simpler: an experienced hiker tragically lost to the unforgiving wilderness. Only Ben, Rourke, and a few others knew the darker, more complex truth, the story whispered by the journal, the map, and that little wooden bird. The funeral was quiet, attended by family and close friends. The raw wound of Anna's absence was now compounded by the terrible knowledge of her last, frightened hours. Ben moved through those days in a fog of grief. The world felt muted, unreal. The house, once filled with her laughter and energy, was now a silent mausoleum of memories. Her hiking boots still stood by the door. He couldn't bring himself to move them. Months passed. Spring arrived, then summer. The snows on Mount Washington melted, revealing the green slopes beneath. Life, stubbornly, went on. Ben returned to work, went through the motions of living. But he was a changed man. The mountain, which he had once loved for its beauty and challenge, now held a different significance. It was a place of profound loss, of terror, but also, strangely, a place of connection to Anna's final moments, her courage, her struggle. One cool autumn day, a year after Anna's disappearance, Ben drove back to Mount Washington. He didn't go to Devil's Notch. He couldn't. Instead, he hiked a gentle, familiar trail on the lower slopes, one they had walked together many times. He found a quiet spot, a small clearing overlooking the valley, and there he scattered some of Anna's ashes, as she had wished. He said a few words, a private goodbye. He didn't find a monster, not in the way stories sometimes promise. The man from the shelter remained a ghost. There was no neat resolution, no final confrontation or capture that would bring a sense of justice. There was only the aching void Anna left behind, and the haunting knowledge of what could lurk in the wild, hidden places of the world. The closure he found was brutal, incomplete, but it was an answer. The not knowing was over. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the vast, silent peaks. The wind whispered through the pines, the same wind that had howled through Devil's Notch. It no longer sounded like a threat or a lament. It was just the mountain breathing, indifferent, ancient, holding its countless secrets. Ben knew he would carry his own secret, his own sorrow, for the rest of his days. But as he turned to leave, he felt a flicker of something other than pain, a memory of Anna's smile, her strength, a quiet resolve to live, not just exist. The mountain had taken much, but it had also, in its own harsh way, shown him a path through the deepest darkness. The grief would always be a part of him, but it would no longer define him. Have you ever felt a place held a secret like this? A story etched into its very landscape? Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments.